Welcome to Spotlight. The Israeli regime has been escalating tensions in the region over the past several months at an alarming rate. On average, more than one Palestinian has been killed per day by Israeli forces this year. The regime continues with expanding settlements on occupied Palestinian land despite international outcries. And there seems to be no end to airstrikes in Syria, and even an Israeli official has implied the regime's claim over Jordanian territory. All these and more are happening while Tel Aviv is facing months of protests against the extreme far-right cabinet of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which seeks to change the regime's judicial system. Why so much escalation outside while facing issues inside? That's what we'll try to find out in tonight's Spotlight with our guests. Researcher and political analyst Christopher Hilali joining us from Vershire, Vermont. Also joining us on tonight's program, we have Professor of Political Science at Al-Azhar University, Mohammed Abu Saada, joining us from Gaza City. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Hilali. Israel has conducted two major airstrikes on Syria's Aleppo International Airport in less than a month. Just as a reminder, the airport is the main port for entry of foreign aid to quake victims in Syria. Iran, for one, has strongly condemned Israel's attacks at the UN. How much of a threat does Israel's actions, like these attacks, pose to regional peace and stability?
It, of course, impacts the region tremendously, and Israel's aggression and the aggression of the regime of Tel Aviv is known throughout the region, especially in the past few years, as its escalations have increased against the Syrian Arab Republic. We must make mention, of course, that the relationship and diplomatic relations between the Zionist regime and between Syria are in a state of war, and they have been for many decades due to the occupation of the Golan Heights. So, of course, Tel Aviv uses the pretext of quote-unquote Shia militias or Iranian-backed militias in Syria to continue to assault the Syrian people and the Syrian Arab Republic. Not only there, but throughout the region, it continues to destabilize its regional neighbors, and it continues to put tremendous pressure on the West to support it in terms of illegally attacking its neighbors, and of course, a possible strike on Iran. So it is a great threat to the region.
Mohammed Abu Saada, the Iranian deputy ambassador to the United Nations, Zahra Ershadi, says the regime's strikes violate international law by targeting the civilian infrastructure. She urges the Security Council to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. That, of course, as we know, has not happened. Tell us more about this lack of international action from bodies such as the United Nations, the EU, the OIC, the Arab League, most notably Arab governments, that has contributed to this status quo.
Good evening, and many thanks for inviting me to be part of this program. Well, Israel has systematically violated international law and international standards many times, whether by attacking civilians in Syria or attacking the Palestinian on the occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And we have witnessed many Israeli crimes against the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. And maybe during the program, I will have more time to document many of these cases where Israel has violated international law and international conventions. But going back directly to your question, why Israel has succeeded in escaping international accountability or international punishment against its attacks against civilians in Syria, in Lebanon, and in the occupied Palestinian territories. Unfortunately, the UN system has been very much controlled by the permanent members of the UN Security Council, in which the US has very much used its veto power and provided impunity to Israel at the UN Security Council many times. the U.S. has used its veto power, for example, to protect Israel from any UN Security Council resolutions 42 times since 1967. Tens of times that the U.S. has provided immunity for Israel from international accountability. And it's not only the U.S. We also know that there are other countries and other members of the UN Security Council, like Britain, who has also used its veto power to provide immunity for Israel from any international sanctions or any international condemnation. It's very rare when the UN Security Council or the international community has used its power to condemn Israel and condemn its practices against the Palestinians. And let me just give you a very vivid example of what we have been witnessing lately. Speeches by radical Israeli ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the national security minister in Israel, and also Bezalel Smotrich, who is the minister of finance and also holding another position as minister within the ministry of the Israeli army. They have been speaking publicly against the Palestinians, and let me just remind you of what Smotrich has stated just less than a month ago when he called for the wiping out of a Palestinian village because a Palestinian resistance fighter came out of that village and shot two Israeli settlers. And also just a week ago, Smotrich was speaking in Paris by showing a map of the so-called Greater Israel, which included historic Palestine and Jordan.
Right.
And unfortunately, we haven't really heard that international condemnation or international action against this Israeli ugly statement or Israeli appalling statement, which destabilizes peace and security in the region.
Sure. Back to Mr. Hilali. Our guest in Gaza brought up the issue of Bezalel Smotrich. Jordanian lawmakers have called for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador following the racist remarks by this far-right Israeli minister who recently denied the existence of Palestinians and the Palestinian people. The House of Representatives almost unanimously approved that motion. Could this serve, in your opinion, as a precedent for other regional countries and Arab countries to follow suit as well?
I think the dear professor is absolutely correct in his assessment, and I also think that in relation to your question, I would hope, and I think that everybody here would agree, that this would serve as a precedent to increase the pressure on the Israeli regime and to increase a lot of what is happening in terms of Israel's role. But I think ultimately one of the main things to recognize is that the tremendous power that it has internationally and in terms of international relations and diplomacy. And so there are a lot of regional partners and allies of Israel that have been forged through U.S. and Western support. So it's unlikely that some governments and regimes in the Arab world would move to this level that Jordan is now moving towards. Of course, it was personally attacked, and its country was denied its territorial integrity and its sovereignty due to Smotrich's remarks. But of course, we recognize that Israel is working very closely with the Moroccan regime, which is continuing its occupation of Western Sahara and its war against the Polisario Front. And so Israel is continuing to make overtures to Arab governments with the support of the West in order to firm its support in the Arab world. I hope that this move to expel the Israeli ambassador and to sever diplomatic ties would increase in that regard, but it's not for sure. And the pressure on a lot of these governments is tremendous, especially when it's tied to international aid and international monetary system, which of course is dominated by the West.
Professor Abu Saada, staying on the topic, Smotrich's comments, if we look at them, weren't just directed at Palestinians. He also took a jab at Arab countries in the region as well. Maybe some of these Arab governments should think twice about normalizing ties with the Israelis because these normalizations, in fact, will embolden Israel to continue with its racist and criminal behavior?
I completely agree with you, and that is definitely a very important issue to be raised up here. The speech by Smotrich in Paris did not only was not only directed against the Palestinians, in which he very much said that the Palestinian people is an invention, and it was invented according to him about 100 years ago, very much around the Balfour Declaration, which was given to the Jews in 1917. But also the statements by Smotrich also were directed toward Jordan, in which he basically on the map that he showed during his speech, he included Jordan as a part of Israel, and that is a very flagrant violation of the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel, which was signed in October of 1994, almost 29 years ago, in which both Israel and Jordan established diplomatic relations with each other. And yes, I agree with you that around 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, a number of Arab countries, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, normalized their relations with the state of Israel, and now that these countries they have to put up with these racist statements, not only from Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but also that Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has not put pressure on these ministers to make them back down or to make them apologize for these appalling statements, whether against the Palestinians or also Jordanian. And I think one thing that took place over the past week, that Jordan Ministry of Foreign Affairs called the Israeli ambassador in Amman, Jordan, to protest and to reprimand him for these racist statements and appalling statement by Smotrich against Jordan. Also, the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs rejected and condemned such statement by Smotrich and many other Israeli radicals. But I think it's about time that the Arab countries who normalized their relations with Israel lately rethink again of their normalization with Israel, because if the U.S. has decided not to extend an invitation to Netanyahu to visit the White House, and as I know that the visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu to London was not a very good one, I think it's about time that the Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel take a much more tougher stand against Israel and against its radical ministers who are speaking publicly against the Palestinians, Jordanians, and the Arabs in general.
Christopher Hilali, the Israeli regime's forces and settlers have escalated their deadly acts of aggression against the Palestinians since around late December of 2022. That's when Benjamin Netanyahu staged a comeback as the regime's prime minister. Now, recently, the Knesset approved a bill that allows Israeli settlers to return to evacuated settlements north of the occupied West Bank. What are the Israelis achieving with this type of land grab policy? Apart from Judaization of Palestinian land, do you think that the Israelis are also deliberately trying to sabotage any prospects of a future Palestinian state?
At this point, the Israelis have no concept of a future Palestinian state. It's all but dead to them. And I think many scholars and academics and journalists have rightly noted that the two-state solution floated at Oslo and afterwards was a total sham and a cover for increased Israeli aggression and Hasbara, the propaganda of the Israeli state, to justify its ongoing settlements and its ongoing, like you mentioned, Judaization of Palestinian land. I think for us, we must recognize that this legalization and abrogation of a 2005 law that forced the evacuation of 4 settlements, and now this U-turn by the Netanyahu regime shows that it is not committed to peace. It's not committed to a two-state solution. It wants a one-state solution where Israeli citizens who are Jewish are at the top, according to the nationality law, and those that are Arab are at the bottom, and all other minorities. So I see ultimately here the rogue nature of the Israeli state, that it completely discounts and rejects any notions of international law and international order and precedence, and its continuing expansion in clear violation of the United Nations and of international law shows that it is not committed to peace at all. It is committed to increasing its territory, illegally annexing territory that belongs to the Palestinians, and is of course part of historic Palestine. And it will continue to do this so long as nobody challenges it, or so long as the aid keeps flowing from Washington and from its other allies. And I think that ultimately, unless that stops and unless Israel is confronted, it will continue this increased occupation and annexation until it takes all of historic Palestine and now increases its territory, possibly moving into Jordan. And I think that this is very dangerous escalation, but is part of what the plan is for the Greater Israel Project, as many have spoken about over the past decades.
Professor Abu Saada, the occupied territories, as we know, have been rocked by protests for weeks over Netanyahu's controversial judicial reforms. That's, of course, in addition to the escalated violence against Palestinians. Now, if approved by Parliament, this new proposed bill would weaken the Supreme Court and grant the ruling coalition more powers in appointing judges. These reforms have also drawn condemnation from Tel Aviv's allies, such as the United States and Germany. Given the nature of the new extreme hard-right cabinet, what are they pursuing with these amendments?
That's definitely a very good issue here. Since the coming of this government, which is the fifth government led by Netanyahu as a prime minister, it came into power on December 29th of last year, 2022. So this government has been in office in about 3 months now, and the Israeli opposition has been protesting against this Israeli government for 11 weeks now. Israeli protesters in tens of thousands, whether in Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities that include Beersheba, Haifa, and other smaller areas, to protest this against the current right-wing government to overhaul the Israeli judicial system. And there is very much an internal war between the current coalition and the Israeli opposition led by Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. Just yesterday, the leader of the Israeli opposition, Yair Lapid, issued a statement saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu is lying with regard to internal negotiations with the opposition to try to come up with a solution to the current internal crisis in Israel. But it seems to me that there is a standoff between the current Israeli government and the Israeli opposition. Every one of them is holding a very tough and strong stand against the other, and it seems to me that Israel is drifting gradually into more instability. For example, the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, has stated about 2 weeks ago that Israel might find itself in the state of a civil war because of the internal clashes between the current supporters of the current coalition and the opposition. And also, the Minister of the Army, Yoav Gallant, has informed the Prime Minister that there is unhappiness among many Israeli members of the army because of these judicial reforms. It seems to me that no solution is on the table on this until this moment. Netanyahu is, with the support of his coalition members, who make 64 seats in the Israeli Knesset out of 120 seats. They are very much going forward with these judicial reforms, which is very much upsetting the Israeli opposition and making things intolerable for the Israeli opposition. I believe that even though the U.S. has showed its displeasure with this judicial reform, and many European countries also has issued statement saying that this is not compatible with democracy, and there are fears for the so-called quote-unquote Israeli democracy. But I believe that Netanyahu is going forward with these judicial reforms at the current moment.
All right, that's all the time we have for tonight's show. Allow me to thank my guests, researcher and political analyst Christopher Halali, joining us from Berkshire, Vermont, and also thanks to Professor of Political Science at Al-Azhar University, Mohammed Abu Sauda, joining us from Gaza City, and a special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.